April 30th, 1945. 1647 hours. Near the Bavarian village of Moosburg, SS officer Friedrich Weber stood at a pivotal crossroads that would shape the closing act of the Third Reich. To his east, the Soviet 5th Guards Army pressed forward with relentless momentum. To his west, the American 14th Armored Division drew nearer, carrying an entirely different reputation. Weber commanded 847 men of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. His radio spat frantic messages from units across southern Germany, each asking the same urgent question: which way should we go? The pattern, recorded in more than 500,000 individual surrender documents, revealed a major but underappreciated wartime phenomenon. German troops were not merely capitulating where they stood. Many were fighting their way westward through German positions, sometimes traveling scores or hundreds of miles, expressly to reach American lines before Soviet or other Allied forces could take them. This impulse was not simple cowardice. It was a deliberate bid for survival, informed by the collapsing Wehrmacht's flow of information about a crucial difference in how Americans treated captives. What Weber and 500,000 German soldiers learned uncovered the unseen mechanics of surrender, the rational calculations of defeated forces, and the surprising influence of formal institutions, more than personal enmity, in deciding the fate of captured foes. The arithmetic of surrender had been worked out in Berlin long before an American foot crossed significant stretches of German territory. December 3, 1944, at 08:30 hours. Wehrmacht headquarters, Sassen, southeast of Berlin. General Ober Alfred Jahl, Chief of Operations, reviewed intelligence that would reshape German defensive plans for the war's end. Reports compiled by German intelligence officers and Wehrmacht liaison units contained thorough appraisals of Allied prisoner-of-war practices. From those reports emerged a sharp split that would doom Germany's eastern provinces while allowing a stubborn defense in the west to continue. The Americans, operating under the 1929 Geneva Convention, followed procedures with bureaucratic rigor bordering on obsession. Their handling of German POWs was corroborated by multiple sources. Red Cross inspectors, returning wounded, intercepted American journalists, and German intelligence files. The American system ran with industrial efficiency. Captured German soldiers received medical care within hours, no matter their rank or unit. Rations, though not sumptuous, met or exceeded Geneva Convention standards. Roughly 2,700 calories daily for laboring prisoners and 2,300 for those not working. The U.S. maintained meticulous rosters of every detainee, and families were notified through the International Red Cross within weeks. But the intelligence disclosed something beyond mere compliance. The Americans had built a whole bureaucratic apparatus for managing prisoners that functioned independently of battlefield passions. The Provost Marshal General's office had established 155 POW camps across the continental United States by early 1945, each run under regulations local commanders could not easily override. German officers retained their rank privileges. Enlisted men earned pay for work. Mail moved regularly. Religious observances continued. By contrast, reports from the Eastern Front, formed from testimony of the few Germans who escaped Soviet captivity and returned to German lines, painted a grimmer picture. The pattern was stark and horrifying. Soviet treatment of German prisoners existed outside any recognizable rule of law. Oberst Heinrich Gerlach, captured at Stalingrad and escaping during a transport in July 1944, gave an account that circulated through Wehrmacht channels. His classified but circulated report described systematic attrition, forced marches spanning hundreds of kilometers with inadequate food and water, medical care withheld even for treatable wounds, labor camps in the Urals where survival for the first winter dipped below 30%, and summary executions of prisoners deemed politically unreliable, a label that often included nearly any officer above the rank of Hauptmann. The calculus was brutal and direct. Surrendering to Americans meant survival with some measure of dignity. surrendering to Soviets meant likely death after suffering that violated any sense of military honor. By January 1945, this knowledge had filtered down through the Wehrmacht chain of command, from divisional commanders to squad leaders. March 15, 1945, 11:20 hours. Prisoner Processing Center, Rayogen Bridgehead. The American 9th Armored Division had seized the Ludendorff Bridge intact 8 days earlier, and German captives were pouring into improvised collection points at rates that outstripped forecasts. Lieutenant Colonel James Hartwick, commander of the 45th Military Police Battalion, oversaw a processing flow that would serve as the American model during the war's final weeks. What set American prisoner handling apart was not sentiment, but system. Over 3 years, the U.S. Army had refined POW procedures using lessons from North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. By the time U.S. troops crossed the Rhine, those routines had been honed to a machine-like precision. Every detainee moved along a standardized route regardless of unit, rank, or battlefield behavior. The process began at forward collection points, typically within about 1,000 yards of the front. German soldiers were searched for weapons and intelligence material, tagged with capture cards listing name, rank, serial number, unit, and capture location, and medically screened for wounds needing prompt treatment. Within hours, prisoners were transferred to division-level cages where processing increased in rigor. There, U.S. Army intelligence officers carried out detailed interrogations under strict protocols from the Military Intelligence Service. These sessions were not brutal interrogations, but methodical intelligence-gathering operations led by professionals. The Americans had discovered that well-treated detainees yielded more useful information than those who were mistreated. Food, cigarettes, and medical care came before questioning. The results were impressive. The physical framework behind this approach mirrored American industrial capacity on a small scale. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built semi-permanent POW compounds with barracks, kitchens, medical dispensaries, and administrative offices. By March 1945, the Theater Provost Marshal's office ran 47 major prisoner enclosures across the European theater, each able to hold from 5,000 to 30,000 prisoners. The logistics supporting those sites, food, medical supplies, administrative staff, represented a resource commitment that astonished German captives, many of whom were used to the Wehrmacht's failing supply lines. Yet the crucial difference was not merely hardware. It was an institutional dedication to rules that individual commanders could not simply ignore. The U.S. Army operated under articles and regulations, updated in 1920 and revised in 1944, that specified exact standards for treating enemy prisoners. Violations could lead to court-martial for offending officers. Major General Hans Kramer, captured on March 20th near Koblenz, later recalled his surprise at American procedures. Within 24 hours of capture, he had received a medical exam, 3 meals, and confirmation that the International Red Cross had been notified of his status. His kit, including his officer's dagger, was catalogued and put into storage. He was spoken to by his rank. The difference with accounts from the Eastern Front could not have been starker. The Americans were not acting out of sentiment. They were following established procedures. That distinction mattered deeply. Bureaucratic systems ran irrespective of personal hatred, fear, or thirst for vengeance. A German soldier who had killed Americans hours earlier was processed the same way as one who had capitulated without firing a shot. The system ignored battlefield behavior. It enforced rules. That institutional impartiality produced an unforeseen result: predictability. Men facing capture could, with reasonable confidence, foresee what awaited them in American hands. That foreseeability, attested in thousands of prisoner statements and reflected in German intelligence summaries, propelled the massive westward movement in the war's last weeks. February 28, 1945, 04:45 hours, outside Kustrin, some 80 kilometers east of Berlin. Oberst Victor Steinmann led what remained of the 309th Infantry Division, roughly 4,200 men now confronting the full force of Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front. The Soviet onslaught had broken German defenses, and Steinman faced the same agonizing choice that many commanders on the Eastern Front were forced to make: fight to the end or attempt the almost impossible trek west to American lines more than 500 kilometers away. The decision was made easier by information traveling along Wehrmacht channels. Reports from units that had fallen into Soviet hands were so consistently grim that even Nazi propaganda could not conceal them. The Red Army's handling of German captives followed logic foreign to international norms. Soviet prisoner policy, as German intelligence assessments compiled from escapees and intercepted messages described, was governed by retribution rather than regulation. The Soviet Union had not ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention on POW treatment. Stalin's regime regarded such conventions as bourgeois niceties, irrelevant to the ideological war against fascism. More to the point, Soviet practices echoed the catastrophic fate of Soviet prisoners earlier in the war. Roughly 3.3 million Soviet POWs had died in German custody between 1941 and 1945. The arithmetic of Soviet captivity was brutally straightforward. German intelligence estimated that fewer than 40% of German soldiers captured by Soviet forces would survive a year of internment. The causes were systematic: forced marches of hundreds of kilometers immediately after capture, often in winter without adequate clothing; starvation rations of about 400 to 600 calories per day, insufficient for hard labor; routine denial of medical care leading to death from wounds or disease; labor camps in the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia, where prisoners toiled in mines, logging, and construction, under conditions intended to maximize output before death. Lieutenant Werner Hoffmann, who escaped from a Soviet prisoner column near Poznan in January 1945 and returned to German lines, gave testimony that German intelligence deliberately distributed to frontline units. His account, corroborated by many similar reports, described violations of every military norm. Prisoners marched up to 40 kilometers daily without food. Those who collapsed were shot on the spot. No medical detachments accompanied the columns. Prisoners with visible wounds were separated and never seen again, presumed executed because the Soviets would not spare resources. Beyond the physical brutality, Soviet captivity carried a distinct psychological terror. The Red Army made no distinctions between regular Wehrmacht troops and SS formations, between those who had committed atrocities and those who had fought conventionally. Political commissars attached to Soviet units performed rapid screenings, identifying officers, party members, and anyone deemed politically dangerous for immediate execution or transfer to NKVD custody, outcomes that were often indistinguishable from outright killing, though sometimes delayed. The contrast with American procedures was not subtle. It was existential. German soldiers facing Soviet forces saw a choice between likely death in the field and probable death as prisoners. The Americans, by contrast, offered a realistic chance of survival. Multiplied across hundreds of thousands of men, that calculation produced the largest mass military migration of the war's closing phase. Steinman made his decision at 06:30 hours on February 28. His division would conduct a delaying defense against Soviet forces, while simultaneously withdrawing in fighting order toward the west. The aim was not to hold territory but to buy time to reach American lines before Soviet encirclement cut off any escape. Over the next 6 weeks, roughly 2,800 of his original 4,200 troops succeeded in linking up with American units near the Elbe River. Their trek became emblematic of the desperate westward exodus that marked the Wehrmacht's final days. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this narrative moves you, subscribe. I've saved something special for tomorrow. April 12, 1945, 13:20 hours, Harz Mountains, Central Germany. General Feldmarschall Theodor Busse commanded formations that existed more in name than in practice. His Ninth Army, nominally about 200,000 strong, had splintered into dozens of ad hoc battle groups, each making independent survival choices. The question was not whether to surrender, but to whom. Wehrmacht communications, though degraded, still passed enough intelligence to shape those decisions. Reports placed American forces halted along the Elbe, roughly 120 kilometers from Berlin, while Soviet formations prepared the final assault on the capital with more than 2.5 million men. That gap represented the last corridor for westward escape. The phenomenon historians later called the Great Westward Flight gathered force in the second week of April 1945. Units across the Eastern Front began what looked like tactical withdrawals but were in truth calculated migrations toward American positions. The scale was unlike anything seen before. Entire divisions, sometimes keeping unit structure, sometimes fragmenting into smaller bands, moved west with single-minded intent. Oberst Ernst Hartmann, commanding the 712th Infantry Division near Magdeburg, recorded the orders and deliberations that survived the war. His division, about 7,800 men, held defensive lines facing Soviet forces 30 kilometers to the east, while American units were 15 kilometers to the west. On April 14th, Hartmann issued directives that explicitly favored westward movement over holding defensive positions. All units will conduct fighting withdrawals toward the American sector. Maintain cohesion where possible. Primary objective is to reach American lines before Soviet encirclement. The maneuver demanded extraordinary coordination and resolve. Units had to disengage from Soviet pressure without provoking catastrophic pursuit, cross ground devastated by years of combat, and approach American positions without being annihilated by forces that could view advancing German formations as continued hostility. The logistical burden was nightmarish. Units transported wounded, salvaged what equipment they could, and kept enough combat power to fight through obstacles while simultaneously signaling a desire to surrender. Initially puzzled by German formations moving toward them, American commanders soon recognized the pattern. Intelligence officers from the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies documented systematic German attempts to reach American custody rather than Soviet hands. By mid-April, American commanders had set up procedures to handle the deluge of German capitulations, at times taking in whole battalions with officers and gear who had deliberately sought American custody rather than Soviet. The human toll of that westward migration was heavy. German formations trying to push west faced Soviet pursuit. American defensive fire from troops unsure whether advancing Germans intended to fight or surrender, and the general disintegration of the front. Wehrmacht records, fragmentary because command channels were collapsing, indicate thousands died not in pitched battles, but in the frantic attempts to reach U.S. lines. German commanders accepted those losses because the alternative was worse. Intelligence, confirmed by multiple sources, showed Soviet units actively blocking westward movements. Red Army leaders knew many Germans preferred American captivity and deployed forces to shut escape corridors. The result was a race. German formations racing to cross into American-held areas before Soviet encirclement, while U.S. units tried to process surrenders and hold defensive lines against remaining resistance. The phenomenon revealed a central truth about military capitulation. It was not merely the end of fighting, but a calculation about survival afterwards. German soldiers made rational choices based on available information about comparative treatment. The westward exodus signaled collective acceptance that the war was lost, even as individual destinies could be influenced by who took them prisoner. April 18, 1945, 0940 hours. Enclosure A7 near Adich, France. Hamann Ludwig Reinhardt had given himself up to American forces 6 days earlier after remnants of his battle. Group from the 276th Volksgrenadier Division completed an approximately 200 kilometer fighting withdrawal to reach positions held by the U.S. 9th Army. What he encountered in U.S. custody confirmed the reasoning that had driven his desperate westward push. The American prisoner system ran with a bureaucratic exactness that felt surreal against the backdrop of Germany's collapse. Within hours of capture, Reinhardt had been photographed, fingerprinted, and issued an identity card. His belongings were catalogued and stored. His officer's coat, wristwatch, and family photographs among them. An American medical officer treated a shrapnel wound in his shoulder. cleaned it, gave him sulfa medication, and bandaged it properly for the first time in 3 weeks. The routinization extended beyond individual intake. The Americans had built an entire administrative framework for managing prisoners that functioned apart from battlefield passions or individual grievances. Reinhardt's enclosure, holding roughly 12,000 German captives, featured arranged barracks, mess halls serving 3 meals a day, a medical dispensary staffed by American and German physicians, and administrative offices processing paperwork with machine-like efficiency. What struck Reinhardt most was the institutional quality of his care. The guards were not unusually warm. Many were young men who had lost comrades to German fire days or weeks earlier. But they operated within defined limits enforced by rules they could not easily flout. When prisoners complained about inadequate latrine capacity, American engineers expanded facilities within 48 hours, not from charity but to satisfy sanitation regulations. The food, while modest, met Geneva Convention standards, roughly 2,700 calories daily for prisoners engaged in work. Reinhardt, as an officer, was not required to perform labor, but enlisted men who volunteered were paid wages credited to accounts accessible after the war. Mail service operated through the International Red Cross. Reinhardt wrote to his wife on April 20th, and she received the letter on May 15th, a fact later confirmed by postwar testimony. By contrast, whispers among men in the barracks who had been in Soviet custody before reaching American control described an altogether different experience. Starvation rations, forced labor without medical attention, summary executions for minor perceived offenses, and total severance from families. The greatest strength of the American system was its impersonality. Unlike Soviet treatment, driven by political vengeance and collective hatred of fascist invaders, American procedures applied uniformly to committed Nazis and reluctant conscripts, to fanatics and those who surrendered at once. The system treated everyone the same. That bureaucratic indifference produced an unexpected effect: survivability. Reinhardt judged that he would likely live through American internment and eventually return home. That same calculation, replicated across hundreds of thousands of German captives, vindicated the horrific westward flight that cost many lives, but spared many more from the fate awaiting Soviet prisoners. The American guards enforcing these rules were not saints. They were soldiers carrying out orders within a framework meant to function regardless of individual feelings. That difference mattered. Systems could provide predictability, even when people could not. Regulations could shield prisoners even when guards harbored real anger over comrades killed by Germans. April 25, 1945, 14:37 hours. Torgau on the Elbe. American and Soviet forces met for the first time, effectively bisecting Germany. For units trapped between the converging armies, this marked the end of escape routes. The corridor that had allowed westward flight had closed. What followed was the most frantic phase of mass surrender. General Major Kurt Felber commanded improvised formations south of Berlin. Some 35,000 men from broken units had consolidated into an ad hoc force. Soviet troops pressed from the east while American formations held the Elbe to the west. The gap that had once measured about 120 kilometers had shrunk to under 40 kilometers. Felber's staff estimated they had roughly 72 hours before Soviet encirclement was complete. Surviving operational orders from Felber show the brutal choices German leaders faced. His men could mount a delaying defense to help other formations withdraw, essentially condemning themselves to Soviet capture. Or they could attempt a mass breakout toward American lines, accepting heavy losses during the move, but possibly saving the majority from Soviet prison camps. Felber chose breakout. His operations order, dated April 26, directed that all units execute a fighting withdrawal toward the American sector, beginning 0400 hours on April 27. Maintain unit cohesion. Abandon heavy weapons that slowed movement. Carry wounded when possible. Primary mission to reach American lines before Soviet encirclement became absolute. What followed was military chaos on a scale without precedent. 35,000 German soldiers, some organized, some in small bands, pushed west across ground wrecked by years of war. Soviet forces, recognizing the mass flight, launched heavy artillery to block escape. American troops, unsure whether these movements signaled continued resistance or attempts to surrender, held defensive positions and at times fired on approaching German formations. The human cost was devastating. Wehrmacht records, incomplete and fragmentary, suggest about 8,000 German soldiers died during that roughly 40-kilometer withdrawal, killed by Soviet shelling, American defensive fire, or simply from exhaustion and accidents amid the desperate exodus. But roughly 27,000 men reached American lines between April 27 and April 30th, surrendering in what became the single largest mass capitulation to U.S. forces in the European theater. Overwhelmed by the numbers, American commanders instituted emergency intake procedures. The 69th Infantry Division, which absorbed most of Felber's capitulating troops, recorded the ordeal of processing nearly 30,000 prisoners in 72 hours while still holding defensive positions and fighting other German formations. The episode revealed the total collapse of German resistance in the West, even as bitter fighting continued to the east. German soldiers were at once surrendering en masse to Americans and fighting desperately to avoid Soviet capture. That contradiction exposed the core motive behind the westward exodus. Who took you prisoner mattered more than surrender itself. Lieutenant Thomas Bradford, who led a company in the 273rd Infantry Regiment, recalled his disbelief at the scene. German units were forcing their way through their own rear guards to reach our lines, suffering casualties inflicted by their countrymen in order to surrender to us. These were not broken men, but people making cold calculations about survival. Preparing and telling this account has taken time. So if you find it compelling, please subscribe. It helps us a lot. Now back to the narrative. May 2, 1945, 11:15 hours. Processing Center, Hildesheim. Major Robert Kellerman, commanding the 106th Military Police Battalion, oversaw what had become the largest POW processing operation in U.S. history. In the prior 72 hours, his unit had taken in more than 63,000 German prisoners, a total exceeding the Allied POW population in North Africa in 1943. The scale threatened system collapse, yet the institutional framework held. What prevented total chaos was the U.S. Army's commitment to standardized procedures even under extreme strain. Planners had anticipated mass capitulations after studying the collapse of German forces in Tunisia in 1943, and had developed protocols for handling unprecedented prisoner volumes. 2 years of refinement were now being tested. Processing worked in stages, each handling a discrete part of prisoner management. Stage 1 occurred at forward collection points, typically within about 2,000 yards of where soldiers surrendered. Men were searched for weapons, given an initial medical check, and issued preliminary capture cards. Teams of roughly 12 MPs and 4 medical personnel could process about 500 prisoners per hour at this level. Stage 2 took place at division-level cages where full documentation began. Prisoners supplied complete identification, were photographed and fingerprinted, and received thorough medical exams. Intelligence officers carried out initial interrogations, isolating high-value individuals. SS officers, Gestapo personnel, and senior commanders, for transfer to specialized facilities. Each such facility could process about 200 prisoners per hour. Stage 3, run by theater provost marshal units, assigned detainees to semi-permanent enclosures and notified the International Red Cross. This stage produced the records that followed each prisoner through the entire system and ultimately enabled repatriation. The Americans kept records with obsessive care. Name, rank, serial number, unit, capture date and place, medical conditions, and final enclosure assignment. The institutional commitment extended to logistics that astonished German captives. Albert Lieutenant Werner Vogel, taken on April 28 with parts of the 11th Panzer Division, later testified that within 36 hours of surrender he had been medically examined, fed 3 meals, issued a blanket and basic toiletries, and quartered with other officers. An American lieutenant told him through an interpreter that the Red Cross had been notified, and his wife would be informed within 3 weeks. Given the chaos in Germany, it seemed impossible. Yet it happened exactly as promised. The system's resilience stemmed from its independence from individual whims. American guards could not arbitrarily change rations, withhold medical care, or ignore procedures because of personal feelings about prisoners. Courts-martial records from the European theater show cases where U.S. personnel were prosecuted for mistreatment, demonstrating that the system enforced its rules even against those who enforced them. That institutional protection made survival calculable. German captives could reasonably predict their treatment. Adequate, if not luxurious food, medical care for serious conditions, the ability to correspond with family via Red Cross channels, and protection from summary execution, systematic torture, or deliberate starvation. By contrast, accounts circulated by German POWs who had first endured Soviet captivity described a world where survival depended on the disposition of individual captors, where procedural protections were absent and men vanished without record. The American system was imperfect. Overcrowding in May 1945 created sanitary problems. Food quality varied, and some guards behaved brutally despite rules. But its fundamental design endured. Institutional procedures operating apart from individual hatred produced an environment where survival was reasonably predictable. That predictability explains why roughly 500,000 German soldiers fought their way west to surrender specifically to American forces, rather than accept the fate awaiting them in Soviet hands. May 5, 1945, 08:20 hours. Forward positions, Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. General Major Rudolf Toussaint commanded the remnants of the 1st Panzer Army, about 11,000 men who had kept some cohesion through the chaotic retreat from eastern Germany. Soviet units closed in from multiple directions, while elements of Patton's Third Army had halted roughly 30 kilometers to the west, under arrangements with Soviet command. Toussaint faced the same psychological calculation that drove so many commanders. The intelligence available to him, drawn from reports and prisoner testimony, presented two stark outcomes. Surrender to approaching Soviet forces meant extreme uncertainty, no reliable protocol, a substantial likelihood of summary execution for officers of his rank, and for survivors, transfer to labor camps deep in the Soviet interior with mortality rates exceeding 50% in the first year. Surrender to American forces promised predictable steps grounded in 2 years of observed practice. Processing within 24 to 48 hours, medical care for the wounded, rations meeting Geneva standards, preservation of officer privileges, and eventual repatriation after hostilities ended. The difference was existential, yet reaching American lines required crossing some 30 kilometers of contested ground while retaining enough combat power to fight through obstacles and simultaneously signaling an intent to surrender so U.S. troops would not destroy them out of uncertainty. About 27,000 men reached U.S. lines between April 27 and April 30th, surrendering in the single largest concentrated capitulation to American forces in the European theater. Confronted with that scale, American commanders put emergency intake measures into effect. The 69th Infantry Division, which accepted most of Felber's men, recorded the ordeal of processing nearly 30,000 prisoners in 72 hours while still holding defensive positions and engaging other German formations. The episode exposed the total breakdown of German resistance in the West, even as fierce combat persisted farther east. German troops were simultaneously falling into American custody by the thousands, while others fought bitterly to avoid Soviet capture. That contradiction made the essential point. Who captured you mattered more than the mere fact of capture. Lieutenant Thomas Bradford of the 273rd Infantry Regiment later described his shock. German units were forcing their way through their own rear guards to reach our lines, taking casualties from fellow Germans in order to surrender to us. These were not men defeated into passivity, but people making cold, pragmatic choices about survival. Preparing and telling this account has taken time. So if you find it worth following, please subscribe. It helps us continue. Returning to the narrative. May 2, 1945, 11:15 hours. Processing Center, Hildesheim. Major Robert Kellerman, commander of the 106th Military Police Battalion, ran what had become the largest prisoner processing operation in the U.S. history. In the prior 72 hours, his unit had taken in over 63,000 German prisoners, a number larger than the entire Allied POW population in North Africa in 1943. The volume threatened systemic collapse, yet the institutional framework endured. What prevented total breakdown was the U.S. Army's commitment to standardized procedures even under extreme strain. Planners had anticipated mass capitulations after studying the Tunisian collapse in 1943 and had spent 2 years refining protocols for unprecedented prisoner numbers. Those procedures were now being fully tested. Processing occurred in stages, each handling a different part of prisoner management. Stage 1 at forward collection points, generally within about 2,000 yards of surrender locations, involved searching men for weapons, giving an initial medical check, and issuing preliminary capture cards. Teams of roughly 12 MPs and 4 medical personnel could handle about 500 prisoners an hour at this level. Stage 2 at division-level cages began full documentation. Prisoners supplied complete identification, were photographed and fingerprinted, and underwent thorough medical examinations. Intelligence officers conducted initial screenings to isolate high-value individuals, SS members, Gestapo agents, senior commanders, for transfer to specialized interrogation centers. Each such facility could process roughly 200 prisoners per hour. Stage 3, managed by theater provost marshal units, assigned prisoners to semi-permanent enclosures and notified the International Red Cross, generating the records that would follow each detainee through the system and eventually facilitate repatriation. The Americans kept records with obsessive care: name, rank, serial number, unit, capture date and place, medical conditions, and final enclosure assignment. The logistical commitment astonished German captives. Albert Lieutenant Werner Vogel, taken on April 28 with elements of the 11th Panzer Division, later testified that within 36 hours of surrender, he had been medically examined, fed 3 meals, issued a blanket and basic toiletries, and quartered with other officers. An American lieutenant told him through an interpreter that the Red Cross had been notified, and his wife would be informed within 3 weeks. Given the chaos in Germany, it seemed impossible, yet it happened as promised. The system's strength lay in its independence from individual whims. American guards could not arbitrarily alter rations, withhold care, or flout procedures because of personal animus. Courts-martial records show U.S. personnel were prosecuted when they mistreated prisoners, demonstrating that the system enforced its rules even against those charged with enforcing them. That institutional protection made survival estimable. German captives could reasonably expect adequate, if not luxurious, food, medical care for serious conditions, the ability to correspond with family via Red Cross channels, and protection from summary execution, systematic torture, or deliberate starvation. By contrast, accounts circulated by Germans who had first endured Soviet captivity described a world where survival depended on the mood and decisions of individual captors, where formal protections were absent and men vanished without record. The American system was not flawless. Overcrowding in May 1945 created sanitation problems, food quality varied, and some guards behaved brutally despite regulations, but its fundamental architecture held. Procedural systems operating apart from individual hatred produced an environment in which survival could be reasonably predicted. That predictability explains why roughly 500,000 German soldiers fought their way west to surrender specifically to American forces, rather than accept the fate awaiting them under Soviet control. May 5, 1945, 8:20 hours. Forward positions, Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. General Major Rudolf Toussaint commanded the remnants of the 1st Panzer formations, roughly 11,000 men, who had kept some cohesion during the chaotic withdrawal from eastern Germany. Soviet forces closed in from multiple directions, while elements of Patton's Third Army stood about 30 kilometers to the west, after agreements with Soviet command. Toussaint faced the same psychological calculus that had driven many commanders. The intelligence available to him, gathered from reports and prisoner testimony, presented two stark outcomes. Surrender to approaching Soviet forces meant deep uncertainty, no reliable protocols, a significant chance of summary execution for officers of his rank, and for survivors, transfer to labor camps far in the Soviet interior, with mortality rates exceeding 50% in the first year. Surrender to American forces promised a predictable sequence based on 2 years of observed practice. Intake processing within 24 to 48 hours, medical treatment for wounded, rations meeting Geneva Convention standards, preservation of officer privileges, and eventual repatriation after the war. The difference was existential. Reaching American lines required crossing some 30 kilometers of contested ground while keeping enough combat capability to fight through obstacles and simultaneously signaling surrender intentions, so U.S. units would not mistake the approach for continued resistance. Toussaint's staff calculated that losses during the movement could be about 20%, roughly 2,200 men. The arithmetic was brutal but clear. Lose 2,200 to reach U.S. custody versus potentially losing 5,500 or more under documented Soviet mortality rates. The psychology ran deeper than individual survival odds. German military culture, shaped by Prussian traditions of honor and duty, had long defined acceptable terms of surrender. Those frameworks had collapsed in the East, where capitulation to Soviets meant likely death, but they survived in the West, where American practices allowed soldiers to yield without forfeiting dignity. Lieutenant Fran Becker, a company commander in Toussaint's division, recorded the shift in his diary recovered after the war. "We are not surrendering because we are cowards. We are surrendering because the war is lost, and the Americans offer us a chance to survive and return to rebuild Germany. The Soviets offer only revenge and death. This is not about fear. It is a rational calculation about what best serves Germany's future." That rationalization mattered greatly to soldiers conditioned by years of indoctrination to fight to the end. American procedures provided psychological permission to give up by preserving military honor. Surrendering to a professional army that observed Geneva standards allowed men to frame capitulation as an act toward survival rather than betrayal. Ironically, the U.S. institutional approach made surrender mentally palatable to an enemy trained against it. By treating captives according to rules rather than passion, and maintaining military courtesies even toward defeated foes, American forces created a setting where German soldiers could surrender without feeling they had violated core martial values. Soviet practices, driven by legitimate fury over German atrocities and unbound by Geneva constraints, made surrender psychologically intolerable even when militarily rational. Many German troops facing the Red Army chose death in battle, not from fanaticism, but from the rational judgment that combat death was preferable to the likely fate in captivity. Toussaint issued his order at 0900 hours on May 5. Divisions will execute fighting withdrawals toward the American sector. All units maintain cohesion and discipline. We surrender as soldiers of Germany to a professional enemy who will treat us as soldiers, not criminals to be exterminated. That distinction justified the risk of movement. Over the next 48 hours, about 9,200 of Toussaint's men reached Third Army positions and surrendered with improvised white sheets, kept formation, and had officers salute American commanders before formally capitulating. The psychology of calculated surrender preserved both lives and a sense of military honor, outcomes impossible under Soviet protocols. May 8, 1945, 23:10 hours. The war in Europe officially ended. Yet the flow of German soldiers seeking American rather than Soviet captivity continued for days afterward. In the chaos of Germany's collapse, the statistical accounting of the Westward flight remained incomplete, but its magnitude was unmistakable. Theater Provost Marshal records logged over 500,000 German prisoners entering U.S. custody in the final 3 weeks of the war, far exceeding numbers surrendered to Soviet forces despite the Red Army's numerical advantage and deeper penetration of German territory. The phenomenon signified more than tactical capitulation. It revealed core truths about surrender in modern industrial warfare. German soldiers made reasoned decisions based on institutional reputation rather than isolated incidents. They surrendered not to particular American units or officers, but to an American system that treated captives predictably, rather than emotionally. Lieutenant Colonel David Morrison, head of the Prisoner of War Division in the European theater, compiled the final statistics in July 1945. American forces operating primarily in Western Germany processed roughly 3.8 million German prisoners between D-Day and VE Day, while Soviet forces, covering a much broader front with many more troops, received about 2.4 million during the same time frame. That disparity reflected German preference, not simply battlefield geography. The human accounts behind the figures show the calculations that produced the mass movement. Paul Richter, a 19-year-old infantryman from Hamburg, surrendered to American forces on May 4th after marching 140 kilometers west from positions facing Soviet forces. His testimony at processing was typical. "I heard from other soldiers that Americans treat prisoners by the rules. They give food, medical care, and eventually send you home. Everyone knew what happened in Soviet camps. The choice was obvious. The institutional machinery that enabled American prisoner care required enormous resource commitments tied to American industrial capacity." By May 1945, the U.S. Army operated 187 prisoner enclosures in the European theater, housing over 3 million detainees. The logistics behind those facilities, food stocks, medical supplies, administrative staff, construction materials, reflected a level of sustained capacity only American industry could support. Soviet prisoner operations, by contrast, reflected different priorities and far leaner resources. Soviet units on extended supply lines, and after catastrophic losses, lacked means for elaborate POW care, and Soviet leadership placed retribution ahead of Geneva compliance. The result was a prisoner regime German soldiers rationally chose to avoid at almost any cost. The long-term consequences of that preference shaped post-war Europe. The roughly 500,000 German soldiers who fought west to surrender to Americans represented a preserved demographic. Men who survived to return, rebuild families, and contribute to reconstruction. Their counterparts in Soviet hands fared far worse. About 60% never returned from Soviet captivity, perishing in labor camps or from brutal conditions during forced labor in the interior. The American commitment to procedural treatment, driven more by institutional practice than by abstract humanitarian sentiment, generated an unexpected strategic advantage. By treating prisoners according to established rules, U.S. forces incentivized surrender, shortened resistance, and saved lives on both sides. The system worked not because Americans were morally superior, but because rules constrained individual actions and produced predictable outcomes. In his final report on European operations, General Dwight Eisenhower noted the effect. The mass surrender of German forces to American rather than Soviet troops in the war's closing weeks demonstrated that enemy soldiers, when given a choice, will select captivity that offers survival with dignity over captivity that offers likely death. That calculation shortened the war and spared countless lives. The untold story of why roughly 500,000 German soldiers chose American custody over Soviet capture was not about American benevolence or German cowardice. It was about how institutional systems shape behavior, the rational decisions soldiers make when choices are stark, and the basic human drive to survive when survival is possible. The columns of German troops moving west in the final days were not simply fleeing battle. They were choosing calculable futures over uncertain death, predictable procedure over individual vengeance, and survival when survival was attainable. Archives now preserve the evidence. Surrender cards, processing logs, prisoner testimonies, and unit files that together reveal this overlooked phenomenon. The Great Westward Flight, a demonstration of how institutional procedure could override personal hatred, how bureaucratic compliance could save lives, and how the choice of captor could mean the difference between death and survival for 500,000 men who made a rational decision to surrender west rather than east.